Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of e-Stewards version 3. We'll be covering the latest version of e-Stewards, which includes the release of version 3.1, and we'll go over the changes associated with this standard. Since it's just 11, we'll give everyone a couple more minutes to hop on as we go through just some introductory information. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Our agenda for this morning is, as I said, the subject of e-Stewards, the most recent version of the standard. We'll also talk a little bit about PJR, some of the benefits of certification. We'll go over the transition timelines, key changes of the standard at a high level, and then we'll go into a little bit more detail with a clause-by-clause overview of the more significant changes. At the end of the presentation, we will go over the certification process for anyone who's new to the standard, who's pursuing certification for the first time. And we'll save any questions for the end as well. Feel free to type any questions that you have throughout the presentation into that field in the GoToWebinar questions section, but I will save them for the end. Okay, so as I said, just a little bit about PJR. We're one of the leading registrars. This list is not all-inclusive, but gives an idea of some of the countries where we currently certify companies to a wide variety of standards. This next slide shows the various standards that PJR is accredited to grant certifications for, including e-Stewards, which is our subject for today's webinar. In general, there are a variety of benefits to getting certified, but to highlight a few, going through the process of implementing a management system such as e-Stewards helps an organization to meet legal requirements and improve the organization's environmental performance. It drives management commitment and employee engagement, assists the business in meeting stakeholder requirements, can improve public image, assist in achieving strategic objectives that the organization may have at a high level, can be integrated with other business management systems depending on the standards you choose and the industry that you are representing. A certification or a certified management system can also drive improvements to supplier environmental performance, can in some instances provide a competitive advantage over other companies by having a certification such as e-Stewards to advertise. And there can be other financial benefits other than a competitive advantage. In some cases, there may be potential discounts for insurance, for example, depending on the industry and the standard that you hold. Having a hard time of thinking other examples off the top of my head, but there can be financial benefits associated with maintaining certifications such as e-Stewards as well. e-Stewards, for those of you who are already familiar with the standard, is based on the ISO 14001 standard. So you see, when you look at the standard itself, you see the ISO 14001 verbiage, and then the additional e-Stewards verbiage on top of that. So it takes the 14001 requirements and goes further with them to apply them to health and safety and data security and other concepts, but some of the drivers for ISO 14001, I left in the slides here for some background information as well. For anyone who's not familiar with the standard, ISO 14001 is the environmental management system standard, which drives a commitment to environmental protection and conservation efforts, the reduction of the risk of environmental impact. Again, we see a benefit associated with public image and setting up that framework for meeting customer or regulatory requirements. e-Stewards specifically goes beyond that to represent the handling of hazardous waste and e-waste streams. So by pursuing the certification to this standard, you're driving a commitment to preventing the irresponsible recycling or handling of those wastes and reducing not just your environmental risks, but also your health and safety risks, data security risks, and social accountability risks as well. So like I said, e-Stewards takes the ISO 14001 foundation and builds off of it, adding the health and safety, data security, and social accountability aspects. Also, as far as public image and competitive advantage, being able to advertise the e-Steward certification represents responsible management of electronics and electronic components. So version 3 of e-Stewards was published in March of 2017, and the deadline to transition was September of last year. So we're already conducting audits to version 3. This is just a refresher webinar for anyone who is looking to learn more about the changes or who might be pursuing certification for the first time, since that transition window has already closed. Version 3.1 was published in August of 2018, and those changes have also been incorporated into these slides. We did a webinar on ISO 14001 2015 when the standard was revised. That is what prompted, among other reasons, the revision of the e-Steward standard. So I left some of the slides in this presentation for background information. We're not going to go through the ISO 14001 portion of this presentation, but the information is available. You can download the slides within a day or two of this presentation if you'd like to learn more about the ISO 14001 revisions. So I just wanted to point out that those are in here, but we'll be skipping them this morning. So as I mentioned, the e-Steward standard was revised to incorporate the changes for ISO 14001 when the 2015 revision was released. It also coincided with the new ISO structure, which is the Annex SL structure, so that the different ISO standards continue to follow the same format to make it easier to integrate the standards for business management systems that are certified to more than one standard. Version 3 of e-Stewards also incorporated the sanctioned interpretations that had been published as amendments to version 2.0 of e-Stewards, and to make various other improvements to the standard language that they had, that e-Stewards had put together in the interim. Briefly, this is the Annex SL structure that I was mentioning. So these common clause names will follow the same format. You'll see these in ISO 14001, e-Stewards, since it's built off of 14001. You'll also see it in other standards such as ISO 9001 if those are relevant to your industry, again, to make it easier to integrate the different standards. Plan, Do, Check, Act model was revised as well, slightly. Can be found in the standard. And again, we'll be skipping the ISO 14001 slides. The key changes in e-Stewards version 3 represent the removal of footnotes. This was replaced or will be replaced with a guidance document instead. They'll no longer do the addendums. Future revisions will be published in a new version of the standard, like version 3.1 that came out last August. So instead of having to piece together the standard with any subsequent revisions and compiling that yourself, they'll just put the changes in a new version and send it out to everyone who has already bought the standard. There are changes to top management responsibilities, changes to the compliance evaluation schedule requirements, and changes to or clarifications of the import-export requirements. There are additional or changed requirements for downstream management planning, emergency plan requirements, internal communication requirements, the addition of asbestos-containing equipment to the list of equipment to avoid shredding, and the addition of monitoring and measuring schedule requirements. We are going to talk about these in more detail. This is just a high-level overview of what has changed. There are changed requirements for tracking of NCRs or nonconformances, changes to the material balance accounting requirements, changes to internal auditor qualification requirements. e-Stewards version 3 has restored some of the requirements that were removed in ISO 14001, such as documented procedures or records and preventive actions. And there were some changes to appendices B and C. I included in these slides as well some key term changes in version 3 of e-Stewards. I'm not going to read these in their entirety, but I did want to highlight that these terms are either new terms or changes to the definitions that are worth reviewing and can be found in the slides. So with the definition of an organization, one thing to point out and remember is that a broker isn't eligible for e-Stewards certification. Some changes to the compliance obligations definition. Significant change is an important concept since it's meant to trigger new risk assessments and reporting to both the certification body and the e-Stewards program administrator. So it's important to understand what constitutes a significant change. Downstream providers were previously known as downstream processors, so a slight terminology change there. It now includes final disposal facilities, but still excludes intermediaries. Final disposition has an expanded definition. Risk and opportunities is a new term relevant to ISO 14001:2015. Life cycle is an important concept in ISO 14001:2015. Strategic environmental management is relevant to ISO 14001:2015, and leadership is an important concept in both ISO 14001:2015 and e-Stewards version 3. since this is one of the key changes in ISO 14001 2015. Leadership has its own clause, and there's an emphasis on leadership responsibility, participation, and accountability in the management system. You see that in e-Stewards as well. Like I mentioned before, life cycle perspective is important in ISO 14001 as well as e-Stewards version 3. Talk more about that. I mentioned earlier there are some changes to the communication requirements. ISO 14001 changed some of the documentation requirements, introducing a term, documented information. But as I mentioned earlier, e-Stewards version 3 replaced some of the requirements or reinstated some of the requirements to document certain things that ISO 14001 had removed. So that's an important section or requirements to pay attention to in the e-Stewards standard that still require a documented process or procedure or the maintaining of records to show evidence of meeting requirements. Okay. So to get a little more specific with the e-Stewards changes, looking clause by clause, understanding the organization and its context, this is the new structure of the standard. The importance of this is whether or not the system, the management system, is achieving its intended outcomes. So intended outcomes is defined in the foreword of the standard or discussed in the foreword of the standard. It's an important concept to familiarize yourself with. It can be positive and negative, present or future conditions, but whether or not the system is meeting its intended outcomes has importance throughout the standard. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, it's important to understand who the interested parties are, what that term means, and then identifying how it applies for your organization. And then once you've identified who those interested parties are, identifying what needs and expectations they have for you as an organization. That should be part of your risk assessment process. The scope has to include both the environmental piece from ISO 14001 and the health, safety, data security, and social accountability considerations that e-Stewards adds. It also has to include any ancillary sites that are relevant to your organization under e-Stewards. And if you're not familiar with the definition of ancillary sites, that would be another important term to review. And the scope and the EHSMS, the Environmental Health and Safety Management System, under e-Stewards applies to all electronic equipment that comes under the e-Steward organization's control, regardless of ownership. So this is another important concept if you're not familiar, to familiarize yourself with, whether you're processing equipment that you own, you've purchased, or if you're processing equipment on behalf of another organization on some type of consignment process, or you're processing it and then returning it. It doesn't matter who owns it. It's coming under the e-Steward organization's control. So all of the requirements of the standard will apply to that material. The management system needs to be documented, and it has to include a precautionary approach to reduce any negative impacts. It doesn't have to be a life cycle assessment, but this is a proactive or precautionary approach using the precautionary principle, which means to take action to prevent exposure even if it hasn't been scientifically proven. They cite the example of implementing controls for shredding plastics with suspected VFR exposure. So the e-Stewards standard takes this approach and requires anyone who's implementing the management system to follow that same approach. If there is a suspected exposure, if there's believed to be a negative impact, whether it's been fully proven or not, to err on the side of caution and prevent that exposure. That's the expectation. As I mentioned, along with ISO 14001:2015, leadership has its own clause and a greater level of expectation as far as their commitment and involvement and accountability. So leadership is required to be accountable for all levels and functions, communication of the importance of the management system, allocation of resources, all of that good stuff. So under the leadership clause, we see the requirement to document the roles, responsibilities, and authorities to evaluate the performance and effectiveness, to ensure workers have opportunities to identify hazards, and the responsibilities identified for the EHSMS team are expanded in e-Stewards version 3. That includes hazard analysis, risk assessments, objectives, communication, management of change. It just spells out more clearly and expands some of the requirements that the EHSMS team needs to be responsible for. You'll notice that we're not covering every clause. So if there's a clause that we're not covering, there wasn't a significant change. So here we're jumping to a clause relevant to risk assessments. Risk assessments are required initially, again every 3 years, and also upon any significant changes. So again, the definition of what represents a significant change is important here to make sure that your process elicits that response. So if a significant change takes place, the management system needs to recognize that, communicate that to the appropriate parties, and conduct that risk assessment. And this again includes any ancillary sites and any other operations under the control of the e-Steward organization. This section defines and expands some of the required inputs for this risk assessment, with an emphasis on climate change and resource use sustainability. Clause 6.1.2 does require a documented procedure for environmental and stewardship aspects and prioritizes action in this section. In regards to compliance obligations, a documented compliance evaluation schedule is required in this version of the standard, and workers are required to have access to applicable compliance obligations. And again, this is applicable to their work. So whether that's in the form of work instructions or training or posted information, there's a variety of ways that this requirement could be met. But when compliance obligations, legal and other requirements are relevant to their jobs, they have to have access to that information. Export, transit, and import compliance obligations section now applies to shipments of PCMs as well as applicable to the organization. So PCM shipments shall also be prohibited wherever any country involved prohibits the transboundary movement of HEWs or hazardous wastes. So take a close look at that change, the definition of PCMs, understand how that affects you, if at all, as an organization. Halogenated plastics may be an exception, and that can be further explained, or information about that can be found in clause 8.8.2.1a. So you'll want to refer to that if that may apply to you. E-Stewards are required to meet ban amendment requirements. Not a change, just an important reminder. Objectives and targets are to be updated at least annually with a documented plan or schedule for how each objective is going to be obtained. Planning for responsible management of electronic equipment must identify both acceptable and unacceptable countries to import, any controls required to meet compliance obligations that exist for the different types of electronic equipment. This section focuses on incoming material. This would be important for sales and procurement departments, things like that. Meanwhile, the next clause immediately after, so 6.23, 6.2.3, and then 6.2.4 focuses on the downstream management, subsequently the outgoing material. So this is more important for the downstream end of things. So 6.2.3 is incoming material, looking at import requirements. 6.2.4 would be more of the downstream export, outgoing material concepts. You can combine these sections. It's totally up to you how you handle them. You can keep them separate, or you can combine them into one plan. As long as the requirements of both clauses are met, how you do that is really up to you. Planning for site closure requires up-to-date documented financial instrument information, which now also needs to be provided annually to the e-Stewards program administrator. That can be found in clause 9.1.8. The plan also needs to include up-to-date information identifying all assets to be used as collateral to secure a financial instrument, if that's the way that you're approaching that. So that may not apply to everyone. Not everyone uses assets as collateral to secure a financial instrument, but if that's relevant to you, it's important that the plan contains up-to-date information about those assets. The next clause goes on to specify that the closure plan and the financial coverage need to include the disposition of electronic equipment inside and outside the facility, any ancillary sites, anything in transport. Hazardous materials cannot be used as collateral or asset value for covering closure costs. And version 3.1 adds that all assets used as collateral must be wholly owned by the organization. So they need to be legally designated for the intended site closure, even in the event of bankruptcy, to make sure that the funds from the sale of those assets goes towards closing the site and nothing else. Section 7, we get into competency and awareness. The competence clause requires evaluation of training effectiveness and adds requirements for orientation of new employees to include certain types of training and certain parties. So not just workers, but people working on the company's behalf who are new to the organization, who may not be considered employees for whatever reason. And also upon changing roles or departments. So looking at how training needs or competency requirements change as roles and titles change or employees switch from one department to another. As far as awareness goes, there are some additional requirements for what workers should be aware of as relevant to their role and as relevant to the consequences to the EHSMS. Workers should be aware of the consequences of not conforming to the requirements of the EHSMS. That's something that all employees should be aware of. And again, that is relevant to their job. Some employees will have more of an impact than others depending on their role within the organization, but still relevant for them to be aware of. The communication clause has more detailed requirements for what needs to be communicated, how, to whom, internally and externally, especially for employees and any contractors or visitors who may come on site. So take a look at that section and see some of the new requirements there. Creating and updating documentation requires a documented procedure. So we're looking at document controls here. And it needs to include a description of changes, revision status, approval prior to use, regular reviews or reapprovals, what that process looks like needs to be documented. And as you can see in the following clause, it also includes retention timeframes for records, removal of obsolete versions of documents from use. So there's some additional concepts to make sure you've considered and identified within your documented process. Getting into clause 8, we're looking at operational controls and operations here. So there is an emphasis on documentation to effectively implement the management system and have that documented procedure or procedures in place. Responding in a timely manner to any new or changing information. I mentioned earlier the life cycle review or the life cycle concept here that's relevant in ISO 14001:2015. It's expanded here in e-Stewards to include some items that wouldn't have been relevant to ISO 14001 necessarily with the management of electronics and hazardous waste. So we're looking at the inclusion of alternative uses of toxic materials as that is relevant to your waste streams within the industry. You're required to have a documented emergency preparedness and response plan, and the clause 8.2 specifies some additional items that need to be included in the plan. These are just some examples, not an all-inclusive list. But again, we're taking the e-Stewards requirements above and beyond ISO 14001 to look at health and safety and data security and social accountability. So you see that accounted for in this list of additional items. And this industrial hygiene is not a new concept for e-Stewards that was already in the standard, but it does require controls for the prevention of migration of hazards. So looking at, depending on the materials you're processing and the exposure to employees, how those may migrate. So looking at break rooms, lunch rooms, bathrooms, how the hazard may migrate into an employee's home, for example, or an area where they're eating, things like that. And the requirement here to respond quickly to new or emerging industrial hygiene concerns. That circles back around or reiterates the proactive approach as well, to make sure that we are erring on the side of caution and reacting to potential exposures in a timely manner. Airborne hazards require continual improvement of air quality if possible. And this section also specifies some control requirements, such as releases related to filters. So take a look at that section if airborne hazards are relevant to your processing methodologies and the types of electronic equipment that you're handling. The section related to noise hazards require a retesting after implementation of noise controls, and the requirement to implement additional controls if noise levels are still above the exposure limit. So after you've implemented controls, let's say you've had testing that indicated controls were needed, you need to retest after those controls have been implemented to see if the exposure level is now at an acceptable level, or if it isn't, as it's indicated here, implement additional controls again. It also requires annual testing if the implementation of these controls will take longer than 3 months. So depending on the exposure limit, depending on the results of your noise sampling and the types of controls that you need, it may or may not take longer than 3 months to implement those controls. If it does, that's when the annual testing requirement kicks in. Clause 8.4.1 adds asbestos-containing electronic equipment, such as knob and tube wiring, wire insulation, or some types of old heating equipment to the list of materials that cannot be shredded without a closed system. So again, take a look at that requirement if that's applicable to you. And clause 8.5.3 adds the requirement for training for any employees who are conducting mobile shredding and data sanitization. Version 3.1 adds a requirement to retain responsibility for completion of the reuse and refurbishment requirements in 8.6 prior to electronic equipment going into reuse, regardless of whether or not the organization outsources any of these activities to an end refurbisher. So what this is saying is, even if you're outsourcing some of the requirements of 8.6 or the reuse requirements, the e-Stewards organization is ultimately responsible for ensuring the requirements of the e-Stewards standard are met. So sometimes we have the understanding or the mindset that if we're outsourcing something, it's not our responsibility anymore, or if we've done a little bit of due diligence that they're meeting the reuse requirements, we can be satisfied with that. But regardless of whether you're outsourcing these activities or not, the e-Stewards organization is ultimately responsible for making sure all of the requirements are met. And that's an important reminder. The slide goes into more detail about the testing requirements for full functionality of electronic equipment. All electronic equipment must be tested for reuse, not just HEEs or PCMs. Any exceptions to this rule are found in Table 5, so take a look at that in the standard if you have any questions. This section does remove the requirement to take back exported HEEs from the previous version. Version 3.1 adds changes to the battery testing criteria, not significant changes, but some slight changes. And there are additional requirements added related to non-removable batteries. So version 3.1 addresses the non-removable battery issue in more detail. There are additional requirements for alternative uses or process for HEEs and PCMs, such as how to conduct and document a regulatory review, life cycle review, downstream due diligence, and written approval required from the e-Stewards administrator. When approaching approval for an alternative use or processing, it's really important to remember, since this is not a common practice and requires quite a bit of research and approval to get this appropriately demonstrated to the point where an e-Stewards administrator would approve it, it's important to remember that an operating permit is not sufficient evidence that this is an acceptable best practice that will be approved by the e-Stewards administrator. An operating permit really just allows them to conduct business. It does not mean that it's going to meet the requirements of the e-Stewards standard. Version 3 of the e-Stewards standard organizes export and import controls by category. It also adds a section regarding exports for repair to end refurbishers. So if that's relevant to your downstream processing, take a look at that. It's important to remember that the HEW definition includes all hazardous waste identified by national laws within the countries involved in trade, and some countries have different definitions of hazardous waste than we may in the US, for example. Trade of HEWs and applicable PCMs is prohibited between party members and non-party members, regardless of consent from a competent authority. So again, thinking back to the last slide with the operating permit, just because approval has been given by a competent authority or a group doesn't mean that it's going to meet the requirements of the e-Stewards standard, which may hold you as an organization to a higher requirement. So between party members and non-party members, trade is prohibited under the e-Stewards standard. There are no significant changes in the area or the subjects focusing on trade between developed and developing countries. That's still prohibited as well. And as a reminder, no consents, such as from a competent authority, no letter from a competent authority is acceptable under e-Stewards for an e-Steward organization if trade is prohibited. So if the Basel Ban Amendment prohibits trade between two parties, and yet there's a letter from a competent authority, e-Stewards still does not allow that trade to take place. Under the changes associated with the standard, you're no longer required to obtain an import permit for plastics recycling, but you do need evidence that the country doesn't ban halogenated plastic imports. The standard now allows the import and export of cullet used to make new CRTs, although 8.7.2 still applies. If new electronic equipment is under warranty and fails or is defective, returns may be made without adhering to the requirements of 8.8.1 and 2, wherever trade is legal. So assuming the trade was legal in the first place and the item is still under warranty since it's new and failed or is defective, the returns can be made. And export requirements for reuse now also pertain to exports for repair and have added requirements related to data security export requirements, and downstream accountability. So I mentioned earlier that exports under the repair category have had some changes, so take a look at that as well if that's relevant to your process flow. In version 3.1, any new parts or devices purchased for repair, replacement, or a warranty are also exempt from 8.9 if the prescribed criteria in the standard are met. So again, without going into a ton of detail, if that is something relevant to your process flow, take a closer look at the clause numbers that I've cited here to understand those changes in more detail. It doesn't apply to everyone, so I'm not going to spend time going through them in more detail than that. 8.9.3 is reorganized to reflect requirements in a more chronological way and differentiate between downstreams that are certified to e-Stewards and that are not. Electronic equipment is not to be processed by any company in the recycling chain that has lost their e-Stewards certification unless or until it is reinstated. So this is a new requirement. If one of your downstreams, one of the downstream processors has previously been certified to e-Stewards but has lost it for whatever reason, you're not to be sending your material there anymore. They lost it for a reason, and unless or until it's reinstated, you would need to identify a new downstream processor. The loss of the e-Stewards certification is a red flag for them, and that would be a problem during your audit. Version 3.1 removed a section covering an allowance to send untested or non-functioning electronic equipment for repair or refurbishment to a domestic end refurbisher without initial on-site audits. So that is no longer an exception that would be acceptable during your audit. Some specific insurance qualification requirements have been added to the standard. So when we're looking at who is qualified to assess the insurance needs, they need to be familiar with electronics recycling, refurbishing, industry risks, best practices associated with the industry. If they're not at all familiar with electronics recycling or what goes into these types of processes, they won't meet the qualification requirements for e-Stewards. Clause 9.1.1 restores the requirement for a written procedure for monitoring and measurement. It needs to include the accidental breakage of HEEs and any associated cleanup that's required, and a schedule for monitoring any operations with a significant impact. A written procedure is also required for the evaluation of compliance process and a compliance evaluation schedule, which is new. Objectives need to be actively monitored. And there are additional requirements for logging nonconformities, security breaches, and nonconforming product. Facility inspections are expected to go beyond verifying operational and housekeeping controls to ensure the actual procedural requirements are being implemented. So that's something to think about that probably changes processes for a lot of organizations where we're typically just looking for housekeeping type issues, labeling of wastes, things like that. That may change your process a bit. Risk assessment and industrial hygiene results are required to be submitted at least annually to a medical professional under 9.1.6 if you are using PHPTs. So that may not be applicable to everyone. Take a look at the definition there to understand whether that impacts you or not. And that's potentially hazardous processing techniques. A mass balance is required to be calculated at least every 6 months with a discrepancy of no more than 5%. Each processing facility needs to submit a copy of the closure plan to the e-Stewards program administrator. There are some changes or additions to the internal auditor qualification requirements. The internal audit needs to yield strengths and OFIs of the system during their annual audits of the EHSMS, and we'll be looking for documented agendas and records of auditor qualifications. There are some minor changes to the agenda for management review in the new standard, and preventive actions have been restored. Inputs and outputs need to include industrial hygiene monitoring, internal audit results, facility inspections, and conformity to the policies. In general, the standard, now that it's been revised, calls for a greater level of proactivity, which goes hand in hand with restoring the preventive actions concept. A written procedure for handling nonconformities and preventive and corrective actions is also required in this new standard. There were no significant changes to Appendix A, although some of the content was moved into the body of the standard itself. Appendix B does change a few things, specifically home-based operations are not eligible for certification. There are changes to corporate certifications countrywide, which now extends to entities owned by spouses. So take a look at that in more detail if that's relevant to you. Ownership charts are required to be submitted to the certification body as part of the application process to understand the relationship with other entities. And annual license agreements are required. There are some changes with version 3.1 as to the e-Stewards program administrator. We already talked about the reporting of significant changes. That is to be done within 5 business days to both the certification bodies, such as PJR, and the e-Stewards program administrator. And as a reminder, this isn't new to version 3.1, but a documented procedure for unannounced performance verification inspections is required. We already talked about some of the changes in versions Appendix C with the removal of the sanctioned interpretations. Talks about license agreements, different requirements for sampling, if you have multiple sites that may be relevant to you, and changes some of the competency and training requirements for certification body auditors and personnel. That is something that affects certification bodies such as PJR and not necessarily the clients. So I apologize, I'm running behind here. I'm going to go very quickly through the last couple slides. Anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time can certainly contact us for more detailed information. My contact information will be on the last slide. But if you're pursuing certification for the first time, you're going to establish that system, that EHSMS that meets the documentation requirements of the standard, conduct any training that's required, implement the internal audit, compliance evaluations and management review criteria, and contract with a certification body such as PJR, where you'll be required to do a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit and address any nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review, evaluating your readiness to move on to stage 2, whereas a stage 2 is an audit of the entire management system, all of the processes, and if any nonconformities are identified, they need to be resolved prior to certificate issuance. Certificates are good for 3 years. So beyond the stage 2, you'll have surveillance audits either annually or semi-annually, depending on your contract, which represent partial system audits, a sampling of some of the processes, followed by, in that 3rd year of the cycle, a recertification audit, very similar to a stage 2 in that it's the entire system, all of the processes, and will result in a new certificate being issued. That's the 3-year cycle that we follow. We'll take a look at whether there are any questions. Again, I apologize for rushing through those last couple slides. My contact information is right here. Austin Matthews, I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager. Nancy Bednars is our EHS Program Manager. She can also be contacted. If you're looking for a quote, our sales department number is here as well. And a recording of this webinar will be posted on PJR's website, as well as the slides within the next day or two if you're interested in finding those. Okay, and I don't see any questions, so please feel free to email me if you think of any after the presentation. Good luck with pursuing your initial certification. If you've already transitioned, I hope that that process went smoothly and that today's webinar answered any other questions you may have. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a great day.